Hi, everyone. I am sad I can't be with you, but you are listening to Horror Nerds at Church, a ridiculously queer podcast where we take a deep dive into a horror film or horror adjacent film and talk about how it connects to queerness, religion, and theology. My name is Pace Revealed May, and I am Macaulay Culkin's last big screen credit for a minute.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and I am the yellow spray paint still stashed under the seat of the van. And we are coming to you live from the Brian M. Eckstein podcast stage at the 2023 Q Christian Fellowship Conference in Washington, D.C.
Woo! Yay! We are so excited to be here. This is our first live show, and it's also hybrid. So it's an experience for us, for those of you just tuning in or listening at home. Like, I got snowed in Minneapolis, so I'm coming to you through the magic of internets, kind of, with maybe a pixelated face. I don't know. But yeah, so just thought it'd be a good idea to start off by saying a little bit about who we are as a podcast. Especially for those of you who have not heard of us before. So Horror Nerds at Church has been around for going on 2 years. This March will be our second year as a podcast. And basically, we are a spinoff of Nerds at Church. If you are familiar with that podcast, they are a lectionary podcast where they look at the Bible readings and talk about all the ways it connects to nerdery and stuff. Horror Nerds at Church kind of takes a different approach by looking at horror movies and then talking about the ways the horror movies connect to theology, the Bible, queerness, all that fun stuff. And so some of the movies we've covered, a lot of scary movies. We've covered like Halloween franchise, Friday the 13th franchise. This season we're covering the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. But we also do a lot of non-horror films, which my non-horror fan co-host can tell you about.
So last season we did the Twilight movies and had a whole season on vampires, including like the kids show Vampirina on Disney Plus with my favorite 4-year-old as a special guest. But we do both scary and non-scary. So I'm not a horror fan, and Pace is a horror fan, is like not a like deep enough word for Pace's horror fandom. But we always do some that are not as scary, and that is why we picked the movie we picked for today, so that it would be available for both horror and not so horror fans.
Yep. And like we've done Hocus Pocus. In our upcoming season, we'll tell a little bit to y'all about at the end of this episode, but we're going to cover like Casper the Friendly Ghost and stuff. So we try to keep a good mix so everybody has some access and entry into our podcast stuff. But my name is Pace. I am a PhD candidate at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where I live in Minneapolis, and I am writing my dissertation on Martin Luther and his Genesis lectures, and I'm doing like a queer anthropology from that, which is a big fancy way of saying I'm basically trying to prove that Martin Luther was a lot more with the queers than people think he was, and then he probably even thought he was. So that's kind of what I'm doing there. But I've also been a lifelong horror fan, and have published on horror, on theology, and all sorts of stuff. So, and my pronouns are they, them.
And I am Emily. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I am co-hosting on Horror Nerds at Church, and also co-host and co-producer of Nerds at Church, the sibling podcast, and also do some blogging, querying, and part of the Diakonia.Faith Collective. So we are excited to be with you all. I am commuting from Baltimore daily. So we're both making our way here. Part of what we do at horror nerds at church is, especially when we have guests, we invite our guests to share a real life church horror story. So this could be something supernatural or some just really horrific theology or actions or practice in a church. And we don't have a guest today, so I'm going to do the real life church horror story because it connects really well to scarily well to part of the movie that we watched for this. So I worked at church camp when I was in high school and college, and as happens, sometimes you start making out with people on staff when the campers aren't around, or when you're somewhere in the course of an entire summer being really packed in and working closely with people. And I had in the like making out with this person, we definitely had the situation that the pastor in Saved is in, where he would like initiate relationship and making out and then would be like, this is sinful and wrong and awful, and then keep making out. And it's really awful to do that. Like, it is traumatizing. So that was my real life church horror story. Don't do that. It's a bad idea. Also, making out is not sinful. Yeah, that's my horror story.
Heard it here first. Making out is in fact not a sin.
Indeed.
As long as it's consensual. Non-consensual making out is indeed sinful.
That's true. That's true. We are all about consent on this podcast.
100%. So the movie we're covering, though, as you have heard, is the film Saved. It came out in 2004, and it was directed and also co-written by Brian Danley, who hasn't really had any other film credits, but he's worked on a lot of TV shows, like the TV show Weeds, which also has some of the same cast from this film and stuff. So we always ask what the first experience was of this film. So Emily, when was the first time you seen this movie?
I actually can't remember if I saw it in youth group when I was a senior in high school, or if our pride group at Lutheran College, where I went to college, watched it. I know our pride group watched it for sure, because it is just great to make fun of the ways that Christianity gets it really, really harmful. Yeah. What about you?
I really have no memory of the first time I've seen this film. I've just seen it in a lot. Probably the first time in college. I know that I have shown this film to confirmation students and youth group students and stuff like that. So we, as an entry point to talk about some of the stuff that happens in the film and all of that. But as far as the first time I saw it, don't remember.
Yeah, it's a good movie to watch to talk about all sorts of things, which is why we chose it and what we're going to do.
Right. So just a little bit of background for the film. Brian Denley is gay in real life. And so growing up, he grew up in a similar setting to Mary in the film, the protagonist. So he as a kid, would pray every night for God to take away his queerness. I'm sure a lot of us have similar experiences of that if we grew up in not so healthy versions of Christianity. When he finally did come out, his parents threw him out for being queer. So then as an adult in the late 90s, he wrote the film Saved, kind of drawing on his religious upbringing and part of conservative evangelical Christian culture of going to a Christian private school. And so he says that everything in the movie comes from either something I experienced, something I witnessed, or something I researched. And the movie is set in Maryland and filmed in Vancouver.
And technically it's set in Baltimore County, and we looked up the bus route in it and it doesn't make sense, but it was fun to look up. Also, the song that plays at the beginning and the end is the same as the theme song for Love Actually, the movie that came out a year earlier, and of Big Love, apparently. So
yeah, the Beach Boys song about love. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, that song.
The love one. That's it. Exactly.
Yeah, the love one. Yay. So we always share a summary, and recently this season, Emily has been sharing one sentence summaries of the movie for us. So do you have a one sentence summary of this film?
I do indeed. My one sentence summary for Saved is all of the worst of Christianity screws up everything.
Love it, love it. So just as a refresher, if you haven't seen the film in a while, or if you haven't seen it at all, just a quick little discussion what the basic plot is. So Mary is a protagonist. She's attending a private conservative Christian school in the Baltimore metropolitan area. She finds out her boyfriend, Dean, is gay. And so she has a vision of Jesus telling her to help Dean, which results in her having sex with him. It does not help Dean, and he is sent to Mercy House, a place purportedly meant to help him with his sexuality. Mary soon finds out she is pregnant. The rest of the film is her interactions with other students, some who embrace her and most who ostracize her in the name of the Lord. Other characters include Hilary Faye, played by Mandy Moore, who is the holier-than-thou type. Her posse of friends, Veronica and Tia. Hilary Faye's brother, Roland, who uses a wheelchair for mobility after a childhood accident. Cassandra, who is the bad girl of the school and is also Jewish. And Patrick, the son of the school's principal / head pastor / something like that, that both Mary and Hilary Faye start to crush on.
Indeed.
So typically what we do is we just kind of like walk through the film and talk about some of the stuff that we enjoyed, some of our favorite scenes and some of the theological ramifications of those scenes. So that's kind of what we're going to do here, and just start right off the bat, the opening monologue that Mary delivers. There were just so many good jokes packed into this monologue. She begins by saying that she's been born again her entire life, which I love.
Yes, I love this. And actually, like my, Lutheran theology is, yes, I was born again at my baptism and every day since, because we are in a process of constant renewal and rebirth. But that's not what she's talking about.
Yeah. She also talks in this monologue about her dad dying, and her mom saying that is because God wanted her dad to be with the angels. So she, as a young girl, also wanted to be with the angels too, so stepped out into traffic and was thankfully rescued.
Yeah, that one, I have worked as a chaplain at a hospital during the beginning of the pandemic especially, and I just gotta say, like, don't do that. Don't do that. Kids take that so seriously because they're very concrete thinkers.
Yeah.
And
then we also see Mary and Hilary Faye working on a giant Jesus statue out, or something, a billboard, I guess, outside of the school. And Roland comments on how he doesn't think Jesus was white. And then the response from Veronica, I believe, and also Hilary Faye was like, of course Jesus is white.
Yep. Yeah. It was Hilary Faye said that. And it's there is so much like packed into just that opening monologue, because that also gets at like the certainly misinterpretation of Jesus as being white, but also there's a whole part where they talk about Veronica, who's adopted, and that she was like saved from being a heathen by her parents. Right. So there's the opening monologue, I think, does a great job at stating all of the things you could possibly think of to harm someone, or all of the ways that Christianity can be harmful. Maybe not all of them, but certainly a lot of them.
Yeah.
And part of that is also, right, the words that they use to insult each other. So they use the R word. They also talk about like differently abled in a way that they're like intentionally portraying as like, that's not actually the language that is used in the disabled, in like communities of folks with disabilities, disabled communities. And so there's this like space to like name, be careful with what you're saying, right? If you are trying to push back on something, if you are trying to argue back on something, and we'll get more into it later, maybe don't use harmful language to do it.
Exactly. And then just that whole theological framing that Hilary Faye has, where she centers herself in her brother's disability by, this is God testing me, this is God making sure I am there to help serve my poor disabled brother, that kind of thing, which is of course very bad theologically, and just an awful way to be a person, and not being a good ally or anything. So don't do that. And then the little monologue, though, just ends with this line, which I love so much. It says, even though I'm living in the end times, my future's looking bright. And I just love that. It's such a cute movie.
Indeed.
But there's a lot of like blink or you miss it jokes like that. There's one time when they're using the Lutheran Book of Worship, which is a green hymnal in the library, that many Lutherans would know. There's also this part where Mary and Hilary Faye are at a shooting range, and the shooting range is called Emmanuel Shooting Range, with the slogan "An eye for an eye." So I love a little bit of proof texting a Bible there.
A lot of proof texting in all of the Christianity portrayed in the movie, for sure. But
Yep. And then we get to the scene where Mary has her vision of Jesus, where she's swimming. She hits her head as she's swimming, and is kind of drowning, when the gardener or somebody in the background sees this and jumps to save her. He has long hair, and in that saving of her, she sees him as Jesus, and Jesus tells her to help Dean.
And not in a she does not do a great job of helping Dean. Her plan for helping Dean comes from Hilary Faye talking about virginity, and not in a like, hey, it's a construct that was made up to control people, but in a, God can like restore my virginity, but just in case, I'm going to learn how to shoot really, really well so that I can hurt somebody who's trying to hurt me.
As we say,
a messy character.
It doesn't end up working. Dean still goes to Mercy House, and Mary ends up pregnant. There's a scene where she was watching this Lifetime channel original movie about this woman who thought she was pregnant, but then it turned out to be cancer. And that's when Mary starts to realize, oh my goodness, maybe I'm pregnant. And so as she's coming home from the drugstore, she's saying, please let it be cancer, please let it be cancer. But of course, she is pregnant. And so she goes to this church. She's let off the bus from Planned Parenthood after getting confirmed that she's pregnant. She sees a cross on this church, and she goes through this prayer, which I just love. She just stares at the cross, says, shit, fuck. And then the worst word she can think of, goddamn.
Which, like, to be real, that's some of the most honest prayer there is. And that I think is a big turning point for her, where she's like finally pushed to the brink where she cannot pretend that everything is fine anymore.
And she kind of goes on this journey where she is questioning a lot of what she's been taught and stuff. And so everybody sees this, and it results in Hilary Faye trying to save Mary in a gentle way. She's told to be gentle by Pastor Skip. And so her version of being gentle is bringing her posse of friends in the van to kidnap Mary, perform an exorcism on her. And even during this part, there's this little joke with the soundtrack of playing Tubular Bells, which is the theme song from the Exorcist film. So I thought that was fun and a nice horror connection.
Totally missed that because I've never seen The Exorcist.
Right. And then Mary and Hilary Faye have this little back and forth, and Mary says that Hilary Faye is not showing what real love is. And Hilary Faye throws the Bible at Mary and says, I am filled with Christ's love. So.
Yeah. And then Mary holds up the Bible and is like, this is not a weapon. And then uses a derogatory term that I'm not going to repeat. But that point where, like, so often, I think, especially as a queer person, the Bible has been used as a weapon, and I know the Bible to be a weapon. And in this case, like Hilary Faye literally threw the Bible at Mary and was using the Bible and like the cherry picking and all of that from the Bible in harmful ways in like a verbal sense, but actually like used it as a physical weapon to throw at her. It's like,
yeah, 100%. And one of my favorite characters throughout the whole movie is Cassandra. So she is portrayed as this bad girl who's been kicked out of every school. She's apparently slutty or whatever. That using that term in like this derogatory, not reclaimed way or anything. And she's also Jewish, so the only Jewish person in a Christian school. Everyone's trying to save her, all this stuff, which probably results in her acting out even more. And so this whole movie, up to this point, she has been the only one thinking that Mary probably is pregnant because she saw Mary coming out of Planned Parenthood, so she's teasing her about this. And then finally, Mary goes into the bathroom, and Cassandra follows her, confronts her. Mary accidentally reveals she is pregnant to Cassandra, and then Cassandra instantly changes tactic and becomes very supportive, gives her a hug, talks her through it, tells her that she was there to support her, she can't do it alone, those kind of things. So that's one of my favorite scenes, and I just love that dynamic of, you know, as soon as you realize that this person is not necessarily an antagonist, but going through this awful thing, then you just the way that you can show support and care for that person, and then coming from unexpected places as well.
Yeah. There's definitely a dynamic in the movie, and we talked about it after we were watching it and stuff, that for Cassandra especially, like she is a phenomenal character and I love her. And she is like so precisely like the archetype of evil for this Christian school. She smokes, she parked in an accessible parking spot really terribly without a license plate or a tag. She's Jewish, which is like a big thing for them. And we were talking about it, and there's ways that like then so much of that gets flipped on its head, and it turns out that she's like the compassionate one. But one of the things that my friend was talking about when we were watching, after we watched it, was the way that like she's Jewish kind of in name only, right? Like her last name sounds Jewish. She is identified as a Jewish character, but they don't develop that. And so I think that's also a place where like they could have developed it more. They could have talked about almost anything that like had a line about celebrating Passover or those sorts of things, and kind of skipped that. They skipped a lot of any of the like actual religious connections for both Christianity and Judaism. Like there was a Christmas sweatshirt, but not actually like a Christmas worship service or a Holy Week service or any of that.
Yeah.
But
except for the Jesus Christ Superstar scene with Patrick being hung on a cross.
Not that
Hurtless.
kind of hung, but also maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And then one more scene that I was thinking of that as I was watching is just the bad parenting all around here. That Skip is a bad parent. And then Mary's mom, I can't think of her name off the top of my head, but she's also not a great parent, and she's like trying to check in with her kid. She's like, "Are you okay?" Right after she compares her kid to like a car. Like, if my car was wrong, if there's a carburetor issue with my car, I wouldn't know how to fix it, so I'd probably send my kid to Mercy House too. And she's like, "But you're okay, right?" To her daughter, and her daughter just, you can see the look in her face of she really is not, but she says, "No, I'm okay," to her mom. So
yeah, that is a real, I think that's a deep thing of like, how much are we protecting, like when we're kids, how much do we protect parents, and how much do we know, like, and you talked about it when you were talking about Brian, the director, right? That like, you can't always tell your parents stuff because your parents have made themselves to be unsafe for you, and to not be responsible parenting, right? To not be the parent who shows up and who is available to talk. And so that plays out huge for Mary. And she's not the only one, but she gets it the most. And there's something about like you're being a bad mom that is different and more than like the pastor being a bad dad, because we hold women to a very high standard when it comes to parenting, in ways that suck, really.
But, yeah, 100%. Also, shout out to Mary Louise Parker, who plays the mom, who's just a phenomenal actress, and I love her in this role. She does so great. But,
yeah, I love her from West Wing, so I am always a Mary Louise Parker fan. Also, I like the other piece, and what we were kind of talking about before, is during their prom prep, when they're getting ready for prom and they're having to help Hilary Faye because they got in trouble for, I don't even know what, something, so Mary and Cassandra and Roland have started hanging out and stuff, and they're helping with prom prep, and then they have pictures of Hilary Faye from when she was a kid that they put up, and the way Roland describes it is that their parents could only handle having one kid with something wrong, and so they sent Hilary Faye to fat camp and like those sorts of things. And so then, like in the movie, she is Mandy Moore and she is thin, but they put a picture of her up from before the camp, and it's one of those moments where it's just like, oh, cringe, like don't do that, don't use prejudice to punch back. And I think we saw it a lot under the previous president in this country, right? That people would make fun of him, and making fun of Hilary Faye, who is popular and powerful in that group, but using fat phobia to make fun of them may not have a huge impact on them. It does on Hilary Faye, but like may not have a huge impact on the previous president, but it does for everyone around you who hears that. And so there's this, like, if you're pushing back on something, if you're joking about something, right, it should be punching up, not punching down, not punching back. And so the language that's used a lot of time, and this is 2004, so I know some of the language I knew was bad language to use and harmful language, and some of it I didn't at that time. But yeah, so there were some cringe moments in that, especially. But I did love, after that, Hilary Faye gets so pissed and is like, something they have to learn, and so she frames them with spray paint, and she like graffitis the whole school and all of this stuff and puts the spray paint in their lockers. And the expulsion scene, Mary has been keeping the ultrasound in her locker because it's safer there than at home where her mom might see it. And the office administrator is the one checking her locker and the pastor's checking the other locker. And so the pastor's like, did you find anything? And the office administrator like pulls out the ultrasound and looks at it and puts it back, says, nope, nothing here. And then it falls out onto the floor because it falls out of her hands. And then that's where like everything, all of a sudden, this whole thing that they've been trying to keep a secret for the entire year falls to pieces. And so then everybody gets in trouble with it. And it was just this like teeny moment of grace, right? Before it actually fell out of the administrator's hands, of someone with power who could have just perpetuated this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And if you put a toe out of line, you're in trouble. And instead says to herself that she knows, like, there is a knowledge there of how dangerous it is and what a risk it is for this kid. And so she tries to protect her a little bit. And I just love that piece and that scene.
And then they get expelled, so they can't go to prom, but they all sneak into prom too, as well as the folks from Mercy House, Dean and his new boyfriend. There's a little awkward scene there, which Emily will mention, but like rob the van from Mercy House and bring a whole bunch of Mercy House kids to the prom. Cassandra, Roland, and Mary, who all got expelled, or crashed the prom. And we find out at this scene that Hilary Faye framed them, and so she's not as perfect as everyone thought too. So it's like this is like the big reveal, come to Jesus moment.
Literally come to Jesus.
Right.
Yeah, I love that scene. And there's the part where Mary sees her ex-boyfriend Dean, and is like, and Dean introduces this guy with him, and Mary's like, he's your life partner, right? And Dean looks back at her so awkwardly and is like, prom date. And it's just like that moment, right, where like I know I have had that, but I think a lot of us have had those moments of like someone who is trying to like be a good ally and like, yes, your life partner, you're that thing, and uses language that is like trying but clearly off, and you're just like,
right.
Prom date. We just started dating. Like life partner, high school, nah. I also love that once Hilary Faye gets like caught and there's evidence and she's in trouble, she takes her van, and then like crashes into the big billboard Jesus, and Jesus's head falls off and hits the van. And she also has had a pimple for all of the like prep for prom. And when she's like screaming mad about everything, she's like, I crashed my van into Jesus and I have a pimple the size of Jupiter. And they are like on equal footing, right? Crashing your van into Jesus and wrecking the car is the same as having like this huge pimple on your chin. And I was like, I feel you on the pimples, like they suck, but yeah.
High school prom queen life, I guess. I don't know.
But
then Mary though has the baby after prom. Her mom comes around, the principal comes around, everybody seems to come around and accept Mary. And in the hospital room, there's this lovely scene where Mary is surrounded by her mom, by her boyfriend Patrick, who she ends up dating throughout the film, by Cassandra and Roland, who've been supporting her all along, by
Dean,
and also by
boyfriend.
Dean and Dean's boyfriend. And then the nurse takes a picture of that. And it's just, I feel like it's a beautiful example of chosen family. There's some bio family in there, some birth family in there, but there's also chosen family. There's the people that helped Mary throughout this entire journey. And just a lovely way to kind of capture that.
Yeah.
And end the film on that note.
Yeah, it is a fantastic, like the village that will help support the kid. And it's a great like counterpoint to what the pastor had said about like every baby needs a mother and a father. And at the time, like Dean didn't even know that Mary had gotten pregnant or anything. And so there's this like single unwed mother, but actually it is this whole village that is going to surround and care for this kid, from grandma to friends to parents to all of that, which is awesome. So, yeah.
Yep. So now we'll get into our kind of deep. We've been talking about theology all along, but the film kind of has a central theme that I think is really important that we just want to talk about, which is this idea that there are certain types, and it's not unique to Christianity, but I mean, if we look at the ways any community is, whether it's a horror community, which I'm a part of, there are ways we can gatekeep people from that experience, ways that we can police other people's behaviors. And this film is really kind of critiquing when that happens within Christianity and saying that that's not a good way to be Christian. That's not a good way to be community.
Yeah, there's a couple lines from Mary towards the end where she's like confronting the pastor. This is right before she begins the labor process, and right before Hilary Faye crashes into Jesus. But she's talking to the pastor, and she's like, who's like trying to get the gay kids in particular to leave. And she's like, no one fits in 100% of the time, not even you. And I think then she was talking maybe to Hilary Faye, but then she asks the question, why would God make us all so different if God wanted us to be the same? And that's the crux, right? That's the point of like, why is there, like, if we're talking about and believing in this God who loves us and who creates us, then why would God create these differences and then be like, but we don't actually like want you to be different, but difference is actually bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just kind of that theme of like, and tied in with that is this notion of grace, like God loves you regardless as you are created. And there's that scene after Hilary Faye gets out of the car and realizes all the harm she's done. She says to Cassandra,
I think
or
Roland.
maybe it's Roland. I think it was Roland. She says, "Do you think Jesus still loves me?" And Roland at first jokes saying no, but then he says, "Yeah, Jesus still loves you. God still loves you."
Yeah. And that's where it comes back to. And I think there's such a diversity here at the conference in theology, but there's this thing that comes back that like, no matter what, yeah, God loves you. And I know for our podcast, part of that is God, who you are, is loved by God. And the ways that you live out your identity or identities are part of reflecting God's image. And like for Hilary Faye, it's do you think Jesus still loves me because she actually did bad things, right? She actually caused harm. But I think for a lot of LGBTQ people, it can be, do you think Jesus still loves me even though, or in spite, like, even though I'm queer, which implies that there's something that God has to overcome about our queerness for God to love us. And like to that, I will say yes. And also, God loves you because of your queerness.
Yeah.
Like it is not just a thing that God has to get over, but it is a thing that is a part of you, that is part of how you reflect and bear the image of God.
Yeah. God doesn't love you in spite of your queerness. God loves you because of and within your queerness.
Indeed.
So we are going to rate the film, talk a little bit about our next movies, and I think we'll have some time for questions, I hope.
Yeah.
So rating the film, we this season we're covering Nightmare on Elm Street, so we've been rating it out of nightmares, but because this is a special live episode, we're going to rate it out of 10 out of, how would you rate this film out of 10 Jesus heads falling onto a van? So Emily, well, I guess I should go first because Emily always needs to think about it. This is how it goes for our podcast.
It's true.
So
it's true.
I will rate this film an 8 Jesus heads falling onto a van out of 10 because it's just such a great film. It really gets into some deep theological points in a comedic and lighthearted way. And yet there's still some problematic stuff as we kind of pointed out, but overall it's still just a great film. It still holds up pretty well.
Yeah. I actually thought of this before you said the number, but I also was going to rate it an 8. I think it's a great film to poke at Christianity and to really draw attention to many of the ways that Christianity can be very harmful and can cause harm, and many of the ways that like humans in even more broadly, like it focuses on Christians, but there's also some of that just everybody does that cause harm, but it also, uses some unhelpful tokenization or unhelpful language and harmful language. And so in ways that doesn't question it. So 8 out of 10 Jesus heads falling onto a van for me as well.
Love it. And something that we do, because this is a horror podcast and because Emily is not a horror fan, is Emily likes to keep track of how many times they jump during a movie. So even though this is not really a horror film, did you jump during this movie?
I did. I jumped when Mary hit her head in the pool. I had totally forgotten about that. And one of the other people I was watching with and I both jumped. So it was, And we also usually do our favorite kill, but there's not a kill in this movie because it's not that kind of horrific. So
But just wanted to let all of y'all know that where to find us. You can find us on all of your podcast apps, pretty much. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. Most of them you can find us on. And this season, we run by season. So this season, as I said in the beginning, we are covering the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. We are wrapping that up.
Yes.
In fact, today, later today, our episode on the 2010 Nightmare on Elm Street remake is going to drop. But each season we do a franchise, but we also mix it up with some movies that typically tie in thematically to the film. So we've covered movies like Suspiria this season. We covered Hocus Pocus 2. We've covered
Everything Everywhere All at Once. We
really
started out
episode.
with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. So
yeah,
we run the gamut on it for sure.
Yeah. But like, we don't worry for you true blue horror fans out there. Not just the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but we cover some pretty true solid horror films too. We try to give a mix of everything. So there's
Children of the Corn.
Everyone.
That was disturbing.
Children of the Corn, yeah. Yeah, we did that this season.
Yep.
Yeah. So also we did Sunshine, a really fun sci-fi. If you're into sci-fi, I definitely say check that movie out. That was a great episode. We have guests like Brandon Grafius, Ben Monroe, a lot of horror authors and stuff have been on our podcast. So.
Yeah. And Eldowd, Pastor Eldowd and Lenny Duncan and some kind of bigger, at least in Lutheran world circles, bigger queer pastor people.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so next week we will be covering Nope. If you want to tune into our podcast for that movie that just came out this past year by Jordan Peele, and we'll be finishing up towards the end of January this season with The Shining, which features a haunting, which might be a sneak peek at what season 5, which will come out later this year, is going to be about, which Emily can say a few things about.
Yeah. So our season 5, we're really excited to do a ghosty season. So we're going to be looking at the Ghostbusters franchise, including the newest Ghostbusters, which is obviously the best Ghostbusters. But
I mean the remake, not the newest one, because there was one that came out after that.
Really?
Yeah, Ghostbusters Afterlife came out 2 years ago.
Oh, well, that we'll cover that one too. But I meant the remake, the gender swap one. But yeah, so we'll check out Ghostbusters. We'll do that one movie with like not Tom Hanks.
Bruce Willis, The Sixth Sense.
No, we'll do The Sixth Sense. We'll do Casper, but that one where he's like the ghost and helping her do pottery.
Oh, Ghost with Patrick Swayze.
Ghost, that one.
Yes,
I've never seen it. In case you couldn't tell.
And we're also going to do Devil's Backbone, which is literally the scariest movie I've ever seen, directed by Guillermo del Toro. So I mean, there's going to be a lot of scary stuff coming up too.
Yeah, I'm.
So,
slowly becoming more horrific in my horror.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know we got a few questions ahead of time, and then also if there are any questions in the room, not necessarily about Save, but could be about Save, but anything really.
Yeah. Yeah. We can also start with one of the questions that we got ahead of time. I think I texted it to you. So there were some people who were putting it in the Hoover, I don't know, the Hoover thing, the Hoover app. I'm super techie, really I am. And one person said, for a congregation that may not be as into horror as their clergy, how can we draw comparisons and bring instances of it into our messages? Which is a great question and part of horror nerds at church.
Yep.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like I get asked this question a lot because there are actually a lot of I think a lot of Christians who are kind of afraid to admit they like horror because there seems to be this like kind of stigma around horror being this like really awful thing. But what I always like to remind people of a few things. First of all, that the most orthodox response to the divine in the Bible is to be horrified. We see this again and again. Everything from like angels coming and saying, "Be not afraid," because everybody's scared shitless when they see an angel or encounter the divine. And so the Bible is actually quite full of horror and stuff like that. And then horror also as a genre is probably one of the most, at least Western horror, religious genres out there that borrows so much from, like, just the notion of good versus evil or some sort of evil presence out there. It borrows so much from Christian notions of good and evil. And then everything like Exorcist films with all the religious imagery in that, to Nightmare on Elm Street. This whole season we've been talking about how much like crucifixes and crosses and all sorts of stuff show up in those movies. And then just the other piece of advice, and then please feel free to jump in, Emily, too. But the last piece of advice is just, I feel like horror is an expansive genre. So that's one of the things we do at Horror Nerds at Church, right? Is we cover everything from Hocus Pocus to Suspiria to Nightmare on Elm Street to Save, because we recognize that horror is more than just this category of something that a film or media that something needs to be pigeonholed into, but really anything can be horror, especially in the way that it can harm others or can cause the goosebumps to raise on our arms and stuff like that. So I like to kind of use that as an entry point too for people who might not quite be ready to dive into something like The Shining or whatever.
You mean Twilight can be horror?
Yeah, Twilight can, and in fact is horror.
It's true. It is quite horrific. So our third season was the first season I co-hosted on, and it was our Twilight season. So we did a bunch of other vampire movies as well, but dove into Twilight with someone who grew up in the LDS church, with people who loved the movies, with people we had as a guest for the Breaking Dawn Part 1, the former president of Now New Jersey, who came in to talk about how it's anti-choice propaganda. Like, it runs the gamut for sure. And I was surprised, though, in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, just how much like cultural Christianity was in it, with the crucifixes, right? The kind of children's rhyme in it is 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, 3, 4,
better lock your door.
Better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. And so like those pieces kind of all come together. And there's like funerals and things where Pace and I, as church workers, and me especially as a pastor, I'm like, that's a terrible, I can't believe that's the sermon that the pastor is giving at the graveside for a funeral, or like those sorts of things. So it's fun to talk about those too, but I think my main point of connection is what you said kind of at the end, Pace, of anything is horror. And it can be actually like really helpful to talk about and address hard things through horror, or through being able to talk about horror. So like we, even talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, like we have been talking about Freddy Krueger, who's the villain in it, as like the embodiment of toxic masculinity and the patriarchy, and how that plays out, and so then we can talk about also how that plays out in our lives, or like our church horror stories, right? My horror story happened in a church setting. Most of the stories, we get some people who have had supernatural experiences.
A lot of Exorcist stories, to be honest.
We had several Exorcist stories last season, but a lot of the stories are about people using theology to harm others, or about church contexts that are horrific, that are contexts that cause harm. And so having some space to like name that reality is really helpful.
Yeah. I also see on the Hoover app, we have 2 people who have asked us what our favorite horror film / show is. And one of the people added if there are any influence in that film or show from scripture. So I think that's a great addendum to that. The problem for me, though, with answering this question is, as a huge horror fan, trying to narrow it down to just one is always so hard. But there are two that I will use to answer this. The first is the film Frankenstein from 1931. That's one that we hope to cover on the podcast soon. We just haven't gotten to it yet. But one of the things I love about that movie is that it's based off the work by Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley was very intentional about kind of the religious allegory in there of the hubris or pride of Dr. Frankenstein and thinking he can create life, and the way that that causes harm because of all the ways in which prideful cis white men can cause harm when they take things into their own hand and think that they are above the laws of nature or of God or whatever. And then another one is a movie we covered this season, Sunshine.
I love Sunshine.
Sci-fi horror slasher movie. Chris Evans is in, like, huge cast. So, but in our conversation with Brandon Grayfius, who was our guest on that episode, he was talking about a lot of parallels between that movie and the story of doubting Thomas in the Bible, doubting Jesus's resurrection. And then I just also personally love in that movie the theodic, which is big fancy theology word, of the ways that the movie is basically about union with God. It's a very mystical thing. And so that's kind of a reoccurring theme in that film and kind of plays out in a horror way. So
yeah, I really loved Sunshine too. I really love sci-fi. And so that's kind of been one of my entries into horror and why Sunshine was such a great one. We also have been, as we're recording this, we're almost to Epiphany. And so we were doing an Advent Misphany calendar this year. And we did an Advent movie calendar last year and had just like different suggestions for holiday movies to watch. And one of them was a holiday horror film. And last year I picked Love Actually, which portrays the horrors of compulsory heteronormativity. And this year for it, I picked A Christmas Without Snow, which is actually what I got because I live in Baltimore now, but I'm from Colorado where snow is the economy. So I was like, this one would be horrific. It was just not a great movie. It was a pretty low grade movie, but I always like to think about that sort of a thing where it's a different kind of a horror film. But also, like, if you think about A Christmas Carol, right? And like that time period that Charles Dickens was writing in was one that, like, Christmas stories back then, like, were that kind of horror and deep, like, spookiness to them. And so that was fun. We, my other podcast, Nerds at Church, we did a movie commentary for the Muppets Christmas Carol. So that one was fresh in my mind. But yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just have a comment regarding like horror comics. I'm a huge comic fan, and I found that oftentimes the horror comics tend to be very moralistic, in which the protagonist of like the comic story would often get theirs in the end. You know, the reason why the horror happens is because either the person decided, you know, for selfish reasons, buy this book of magical spells, and then in the end he gets his, you know, and that's the horror part. And I was wondering if horror comics would be something that you would talk about in a future broadcast, or is, you know.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I have two answers for that. One is, thank you foremost for that question. But when we have covered media that is based off of comics, we did 30 Days of Night, which is based off of a graphic novel. We did Blade, which is based off the long-running Marvel character. We will definitely take time to tie that into the comics. And for our Nightmare on Elm Street retrospective, we're also going to talk about the Freddy versus Jason versus Ash comic book series that came out with that. And then the second thing, though, is one of the goals that Emily and I have talked about quite a bit is to start a Horror Nerds at Church book club. So if we can get enough Patreon support, so this is, if y'all like us, support us on Patreon. And then that's something we really would love to do, because then we could bring in like comic books, novels, all sorts of stuff. Talk about, like, we're going to cover The Shining. We could even read through The Shining together as part of that, and then kind of do like a more fun way to do that. And then also on Patreon, we don't just cover movies, we cover TV shows. So we have a BooTube once a month where we cover a TV show and talk about the horrors on that on Patreon. So I could also see us maybe doing that for comics or other sort of media down the road. That might be fun.
Yeah. So we did the Blade episode last season during our Vampire Twilight season, and Lenny Duncan was on it, who's a friend of the podcast, and they loved the Blade comics growing up. So definitely, like, I hadn't ever read the Blade comics, but they brought in a lot of the Blade comics and that into the conversation as well. And Pace and them had more of that conversation than I did. But I think one of the things, so when we do favorite kills, right? My favorite kill is almost always the like asshole that gets killed, right? Because I'm like, you're being a jerk and you're not believing, like Nightmare on Elm Street, you're not believing the women who are telling you this is happening. So yeah, I'm gonna vote for my favorite kill being you're an asshole. And so we do talk about that in like the movie context, because we talked about it especially on our Freddy versus Jason film, because Jason and that was the Friday the 13th.
Yeah, Jason the Friday the 13th series. Yep.
Yeah. So Jason, like, that started out a lot more moralistic and like killing people because they were immoral.
Yeah.
Right. Air quotes for those who can't see. And that's that's something that does get teased out more and that we can talk about in movies in different ways. But yeah, as Pace said, I think right now our Patreon is $5 a month, and you get a movie commentary and a BooTube episode every month. Within reason, sometimes life happens. But we've talked about doing like a $10 a month tier or something, and then having like a book club, or even having like Pace has amazing recommendations for horror movies that people might actually like, even if you're not a horror fan. So like that would be potentially that too. So
And one of our BooTubes coming up, we have been in the works for a long time. I can't say who the guest is, but the guest that we're trying to get on for this BooTube, who's interested and excited to come on, is a comic book author and has a TV show based off of his comic book franchise. So I'm trying to keep my fingers crossed that we can book him and stuff. So like there definitely stuff in the works, and thank you so much for that suggestion, because I am a big comic book nerd fan myself, so I'm all about that.
Yeah. Any other? I think we have maybe time for one more question if we have it. Wonderful. Well, that's it for our show. Thanks for joining us. For those who will in the future be listening to this on our Patreon, perhaps, our theme music that we didn't hear in the room was by Matt May. Horror Nerds at Church releases every Thursday. And we love when you comment, rate, and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us on Patreon and get access to exclusive movie commentary episodes, BooTube episodes, and more bonus content by going to patreon.com/horrornerdsattchurch. It's only $5 to sign up, cheaper than the disposable camera, or the taxi ride that both happened in this movie took me back. I love disposable cameras, and now I really want one. Also, follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram at Horror Nerds at Church, and Twitter at HNACPOD for all the latest updates about upcoming films, news, and other announcements. Until next time, sometimes the best prayer really is shit. Fuck. Thanks.
Thank you. Y'all are amazing.